Hi everybody. Everyone who's eating lunch right now is missing out, let's put it that way. Okay, so I'm here to talk to you about data onboarding best practices. I made the cardinal sin of not having an intro slide up, but just to let you know, my name is Ryan Johnson. I look after the technical field team across India, Japan, Australia and New Zealand. I've been playing in the logging, monitoring and troubleshooting space. I've been with Sumo for 4.5 years, but I've been in the monitoring troubleshooting space for probably about, particularly logging, for the last 11 years. Monitoring troubleshooting for the last 20, I used to have hair. So, let's go in and tell you why you can keep your hair. And button, there we go. So the takeaways I want for everybody here. Data, data, data. And if you know Aussies, it ends in oi, oi, oi. Number one, classify your data. Be consistent, make it usable. Number two, ingest your data cleanly. So you want to make sure that you can trust the data that's going in. So I'm going to go through a little bit about the problem shortly. And trusting your data. So with the clean data coming in, and with you trusting your data, you can make the right decisions based on the insights you get out of it. But let's talk about the problem. If you're not careful about how you bring data into the platform, you run the risk of running these. Future or past dated data. So if the timestamps aren't correct, you might actually be ingesting data with a future date, or even in the past date. So if it's in the future, by the time an alert comes through for your monitoring and alerting, you might find out that, well, it happened 10 hours ago. Even probably a worst case is when you ingest it into the past, where you actually never find out about it if you've got real-time searches enabled. Spaghettified multi-line events. This is where a multi-line event, such as a stack trace, might be broken up into individual lines. That's probably the worst case scenario there is you're creating garbage, because by default, if Sumo can't detect a timestamp, it will just apply the receipt time to that event, and you're going to get things all out of whack. You're going to have non-data data. Don't know how that works, but this is headers. So there might be a header in your in a CSV file that isn't really that useful to you. So you can filter that out later. I'm going to show you how to do that. Useless data. So things like heartbeats, things that your applications or your third-party applications might be generating that you have no real control over. Non-compliant data, you have to redact that data on the way in, just to make sure you stay in compliant with your regulatory compliance and legislative compliance requirements, like PCI DSS, GDPR, etc. And then the last one is non-intuitive metadata. So really around naming your data something that is usable and useful to the people who are going to be using your data in the end. So let's talk about that last one first, data enrichment and why you should care about it. Using metadata is part art and part science, and science is not an exact science, said me just now. So let's talk about, oh, hang on. Oh, that's right. Let's go back into one. Okay. Oh, wrong button. Sorry, there we go. There we go. I'm going to talk about the art and science shortly, but let's talk about why metadata is important. It lays the foundation for knowledge management. I would be telling you this if I was working for Sumo or any of its competitors. I've been playing this in this space for a while. You need to have the foundations. Your metadata is your foundations. But coming back to Sumo, if you use metadata in your searches, they will run quicker. Our platform has been optimized to return data to you more promptly if you tell us what you're looking for. Indexing and partitioning your data, kind of outside the scope of what we're going to talk about today. Field extraction rules. They allow you to hierarchically apply rules to get fields and values out of your data. And controlling who has access to it. I'm going to touch on that a little bit as we actually go through the onboarding checklist shortly. So I said part art, part science. Let's talk about the science part. The science part is, well, your source category, how you classify your data. And when I say science part, it's quite prescriptive. It should be clear what it is. Apache access, Windows events, Nginx errors. You know, to a user of your environment, they should be able to look at that source category and go, I know what that is, in the context of the applications and platforms you use. And it should be clear, and that's probably the key thing. I've had customers who are now, they're better now, actually, customers who have actually called their source category logs. This is not a good description because everything going into Sumo Logic is technically a log, metrics notwithstanding. The art part, however, this is where you and your company come into play. How you need to use, consume and secure your data is the art part. Now, historically, we've applied this as a part of the source category. Now we've got the capability to do data enrichment. And you can see an example right here. So now you can, on a per source basis, you can say my environment is prod. My team is web, so the web team, etc. So, and you can use these fields and values to control who has access to your data, as well as help you with the usability of it. So if you want to search across all my production environment, you have the metadata to say environment equals prod, and there it all is. This could be a simple matter of just sitting down and agreeing it, write it down, just to make sure that everyone's in agreement of what the standards are. On the other end of the scale, I've dealt with one of our, you might have seen Rick Jury up here from Xero. They spent 2 days sorting that out. So, but they get the importance of it. And we're going to talk about the RBAC implications of that shortly. Because RBAC, and we're going to keep this very high level in the context of data onboarding. So what is RBAC, role-based access control? It allows you to define logical groupings of users and the permissions and the capabilities they have and the data that they can access. And just as a kind of a technical component here, they can be, you can integrate our RBAC definitions with your IDP. So you can say a member of this group in my Active Directory or my Okta environment is a member of this role in Sumo Logic. But why is RBAC being mentioned here in data onboarding best practices? I'll tell you in a second. Because this is how you do it. So this is actually the new UI, how to configure role-based access control. This is where you can specify a name of a group, so for instance production web server support, and you can constrain what that group has access to via the metadata that you've previously applied. So product environment equals prod, team equals web. And this will, any filter that's included like that will be transparently included in any search that a member of that group runs. And this is, we'll touch on this in just a moment, how this applies to data onboarding. And there's the other components here that you can control who has access to what, who can create sources, delete sources, etc. But let's just stick with the idea of a role-based search filter for now. Now, I like to think of myself as pretty zen, but let's just talk about more art, the art of data onboarding. And I have hopefully included a checklist for you. Now, keep in mind, this is coming from my experience in playing in this space, as I mentioned, for the last nearly 11 years. But first and foremost, remember that source categorization, that metadata strategy we spoke about before? Make sure you adhere to it. Everybody who logs into your environment should have a consistent understanding of the data that they're looking at, and it should be intuitive. So, number one. Number two, we're going to use that RBAC capability and control who has access to what data, because we're going to filter out the unclean data as we're bringing it on board and testing it until we're happy with its configuration. And I'll take you through a real example of this shortly. Then we're going to onboard a candidate host or a candidate source, something that reflects the wider group of data that we're going to be bringing on board, just to make sure we get that right. Validate the timestamp extraction. Absolutely essential. In fact, if this was listed in order of priority, I'd put timestamps at the top. It is probably the most common mistake that I see, where people don't get the timestamp right, and as soon as you don't have the time right, you can't trust your data. Confirm and configure multi-line events, probably one of my big bugbears early. I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail shortly. Data processing rules for the filtering, masking and redacting, and finally, the promotion of the data source to a production environment, and I'll give you examples of that shortly. Now I'm going to take that idea of applying a role-based access filter to the data that you are onboarding. Now before we created metadata that said, where is it? We had data that said environment equals prod and team equals web. We're creating a different one here. We're actually going to call this one data equals unclean on a per source basis. Now, this is just metadata where it's data about data. We're just tagging this as we don't trust this data yet. So it's just a way to do this as we're configuring all the components, the filtering, the timestamps, the field extractions, etc. We're going to do this. And then we're going to create a role definition or a search filter for every other user in the environment who doesn't know about this new data being onboarded, so they don't see it. And the reason for this is, one of the most common things I see is users who don't use metadata in their environment, they might be looking for errors. And like just a straight string match for, if I see the word error, critical, fault, fail, fatal, then I need to be told about this. This will make sure that your data that you're onboarding does not pollute their searches until it's ready to do so. Time to get some data in. That one at the top there is important. Don't boil the ocean. I've seen it where an organisation says, we want to bring on board our custom application logs from S3, and they pointed at a bucket and it's got 30 days worth of data and they've been ingesting 100 gigabytes a day, and here's 3 terabytes of data, and oh, we didn't get the timestamps right. You've just got 3 terabytes of garbage that you can't trust, and you've just eaten into your Sumo quota. So don't boil the ocean. Bring on board a candidate data source to make sure you get this right. And it should be representative. The data you bring on board should represent the wider data source. So for instance, if you've got a fleet of firewalls, hypothetically, you've got, let's say 20 Palo Alto firewalls. You want to bring on board one data source, not only per firewall, but for firmware revision, because the logging might change. So you want to have a consistency in the logging formats, both in terms of timestamps, field extractions, the data you want to ingest, to make sure there's some consistency there. Onboard enough data so you've got a good sample set to draw from. I've seen another anecdotal example is where we've had a customer say, oh, I've got my custom application logs. They brought on board 2 hours worth. Said, okay, great, nice consistency, timestamp's good, we're good to go. And they unleashed the floodgates and brought in every other application, but didn't capture the fact that occasionally it's through an error, which is a multi-line event. And that would also break the field extraction rules because it was in a different format. So make sure you're bringing enough data that is representative of not just the data that's coming on board, but the different types and permutations of events that can be generated. And the other one as well here is in terms of license quota. This is particularly useful because when I run a proof of concept, we always bring on board one candidate source that reflects the production load. And it's nice to extrapolate from there. So if I brought on one particular server, you can see, okay, that brought on board 5 gigabytes of data. I have 10 of those, hence 50 gigabytes, and helps shape what your requirements are going to be. And it might actually help shape how you're going to be filtering your data to keep your potential ingest down to the data that's going to be valuable to you. Timestamp extraction and validation. Now remember, my point before, getting the timestamp of the event correct is the single most important thing in terms of getting that data in. You can do field extractions later via the search queries. You can fix up field extraction rules, but once data is in, that's it. So get your data right. And I think probably, I've been with Sumo a little while now, about a year and a half ago, we improved our timestamp testing capability to, in the source configuration, you'll see automatically detect the format. Now, we will automatically detect most formats, so your IIS, anything that looks like a standard ISO timestamp format, we'll do pretty well at. For me personally, I like to remove any ambiguity. I always specify it because I want to make sure that it extracts it out. I want to make sure that it aligns with what I see. And test it. Test your timestamp parsing. So we can see here we've created a template up here where the big yellow arrow is. And down here, we've clicked test, placed it in a sample event here, and we've confirmed that the timestamp aligns with what we'd expect to see. Now, I'm saying test this because I'm just trying to emphasize timestamps are important. It's probably the most common thing that I see I have to fix up in a customer environment, and it also impacts the value you get out of the environment and your return on investment. But the helpful hint I've got for you, if sometimes you've onboarded data and you go, I can't see, where's my events? I just onboarded a whole bunch of data, I've done a search in Sumo, I don't see it. Click on, use receipt time. It's underneath the search button. Because if you don't see data in there, and if you click on use receipt time, it'll use the time we've received the event as opposed to the timestamp we've extracted. And this makes sure that, yes, data's coming in, but it also might help you identify where there's a difference between the timestamp and the receipt time, particularly for live event feeds, that needs to be fixed. So potential timestamp issues there. Confirming and configuring multi-line events. It's only so exciting I can make data onboarding, but this is, I think, one of the things that to be honest with you, I kind of struggled with when I started at Sumo. I think every technical person does, is the application of regular expressions to identify an entire first line of an event. Typically they start with a timestamp, but not always. So honestly, as you're onboarding your unclean data, my recommendation is start with infer boundaries first, because we'll get it right most of the time in my experience. And yeah, so start with infer boundaries. If that doesn't work, specify a boundary regex, and you specify the entire first line of a given event. This one's a super simple example. This is just looks for something that is a JSON structure. Capture until I see the next start of a JSON structure. And finally, data processing rules. These are really, really useful, not just for the obvious reasons of whitelisting and blacklisting events. So, for instance, debug events. Very rarely do we see a need for debug. When we do see it, we have a fantastic new capability called frequent analytics tiers that allow you to ingest lower volume data at a lower price point. But for most of the time, you might want to filter these out. But that's just half of what we can do with data processing rules. So, for instance, you might want to say, I don't need to see the useless data, so the headers. So I might filter out every event that starts with a hash. Don't send that to Sumo. There's also the way to filter, so mask sensitive information using a hashing symbol or a string redaction. But there's the other part of redacting or masking that you can use where you can replace large blocks of text with a smaller string. And this happens before ingestion. My favorite example of this, it's weird to have a favorite example of data processing, but for Windows events. So if you've all seen a Windows event, you'll see the metadata at the top, you'll see a little bit insertion string, and then you'll see a short 15-page novel down the bottom. You can actually create a data processing rule which will replace that entire novel with a small string saying, I ain't sending that. And the end result is what's sent through to Sumo Logic, and that's what goes towards your quota usage. So here we are. So at this point we have a source with the timestamp. We're good. We have a multi-line events we're happy with. We've filtered out data we're not interested in. We've redacted the information we have to maintain compliance purposes. The only thing to do here is remember that the metadata we applied saying data equals unclean, just remove it. And that means everybody in your environment now has a clean data feed coming through that they can trust, the timestamps are right, the data is clean, and you have a configuration that you can apply across the board that you know is going to work with every single source of the same type consistently. And with that, make sure you profit. I can't help you with number 3, that's your business. Okay. So the 3 key takeaways. Data, data, data. Anyway, I'm not going to be that Aussie. So hopefully I'm just reinforcing those points. Classify your data properly through metadata, consistent metadata. Ingest your data cleanly through the checkpoints, the checklist I gave you before. And after that, you can definitely trust your data because you know it's clean. And with that, Thank you. So you can, and if you have any questions at all, I believe these presentations will be shared. But you can find me on the Sumo Logic Slack channel, the dojo. Feel free to message me directly. I have perverse pleasure in helping people figure out regular expression problems. But coming up next, I was not going to interrupt Michael Marfis, our head of product management, so I had to get started. And please, if you have any feedback, I encourage you to take a photo of that little QR code thing up there and let the powers that be know that some Australian spoke to you for 30 minutes. You don't know what he said because of the accent. Thank you very much.